The girl was late getting home for supper, so she took a shortcut through the cemetery. But oh, it made her nervous. When she saw another girl ahead of her, she hurried to catch up. "Do you mind if I walk with you?" she asked. "Walking through the cemetery at night scares me." "I know what you mean," the other girl said. "I used to feel that way myself when I was alive." Fred and Jean went to the same high school, but they met for the first time at the Christmas dance. Fred had come by himself, and so had Jean. Soon Fred decided that Jean was one of the nicest girls he had ever met. They danced together for most of the evening. At 11 o'clock, Jean said, "I have to leave now. Can you give me a ride?" "Sure," he said. "I've got to go home too." "I accidentally drove my car into a tree on the way over here," Jean said. "I guess I wasn't paying attention." Fred drove her to the head of Brady Road. It was in a neighborhood he didn't know very well. "Why don't you drop me off here?" Jean said. "The road up ahead is in really bad condition. I can walk from here." Fred stopped the car and held out some tinsel. "Have some," he said. "I got it at the dance." "Thank you," she said. "I'll put it in my hair." And she did. "Would you like to go out sometime? To a movie or something?" Fred asked. "That would be fun," Jean said. After Fred drove off, he realized he did not know Jean's last name or her telephone number. "I'll go back," he thought. "The road can't be that bad." He drove slowly down Brady Road through thick woods, but there wasn't a sign of Jean. As he came around a curve, he saw the wreckage of a car ahead. It had crashed into a tree and had caught fire. Smoke was still rising from it. As Fred made his way to the car, he could see someone trapped inside, crushed against the steering column. It was Jean. In her hair was the Christmas tinsel he had given her. There was a fellow named Larry Berger who wasn't afraid of anybody alive, but anybody who was dead scared the wits out of him. One night, Larry was out driving in the country in his old Jeep when he got caught in a bad thunderstorm. The rain was coming down in sheets. Since his Jeep didn't have a top to it, Larry started looking for a place to take shelter. But at the first place he came to, he didn't even slow down. It was an old deserted cabin, probably as dry as a bone inside, but Larry knew for a fact that it was haunted, and he wasn't going to stay there. A few miles farther, he came to an old abandoned church standing all alone in a field. It hadn't been used in years. All the window glass was gone, but it still had sections of the roof intact. So Larry parked his Jeep and ran inside. It was as dark as could be in there. Larry groped around until he found a pew and sat down. It was nice and dry, just as he thought it would be, and he stretched out his legs and made himself comfortable. Suddenly, there was a big flash of lightning, and Larry saw that he wasn't the only one in that church. There were people sitting in almost every pew. They all had their heads bowed as if they were praying, and they were all dressed in white. "These must be ghosts sitting in their shrouds," Larry thought. They must have come in from the graveyard to get dry." Larry jumped up and ran down the aisle as fast as he could, right smack into one of the ghosts. And the ghost, he went, meh. Daisy Clark had been in a coma for more than a month when the doctors said that she had finally died. She was buried on a cool summer day in a small cemetery about a mile from her home. "May she always rest in such peace," her husband said. But she didn't. Late that night, a grave robber with a shovel and a lantern began to dig her up. Since the ground was still soft, he quickly reached the coffin and got it open. His hunch was right. Daisy had been buried wearing 2 valuable rings, a wedding ring with a diamond in it, and a ring with a ruby that glowed as if it were alive. The thief got down on his knees and reached into the coffin to get the rings, but they were stuck fast on her fingers. So, he decided that the only way to get them off was to cut off her fingers with a knife. But when he cut into the finger with the wedding ring, it began to bleed, and Daisy Clark began to stir. Suddenly, she sat up. Terrified, the thief scrambled to his feet. He accidentally kicked over the lantern, and the light went out. He could hear Daisy climb out of her grave. As she moved past him in the dark, he stood there frozen with fear, clutching the knife in his hand. When Daisy saw him, she pulled her shroud around her and asked, "Who are you?" And when the grave robber heard this corpse speak, he ran. Daisy shrugged her shoulders and walked on and never once looked back. But in his fear and confusion, the thief fled in the wrong direction. He pitched headlong into her grave, fell on the knife, and stabbed himself. While Daisy walked home, the thief bled to death. On her way home from the market, a woman took a shortcut through the cemetery. There, sticking up out of the ground, she saw a big bone. She picked it up and looked it over carefully. "Oh, this will make a very good soup bone," she said. "I think I'll take it home. It's perfect weather for hot soup." When she got home, the first thing she did was start the soup. Into the big soup pot went water, carrots, green beans, corn, barley, onions, potatoes, a snitch of beef, some salt and pepper, and the bone. She brought it all to a boil, then brought it down to a simmer. "Yum," she said, sniffing it and tasting it. "I can hardly wait till supper." Suddenly, she heard a small voice.
"Please, give me back my bone."
The woman paid no attention. Soon, she heard the voice again.
"May I have back my bone, please?"
The woman was reading the newspaper, and again she didn't take any notice. In a little while, the voice spoke up once more. It was beginning to sound angry.
"Give me back my bone!"
The woman kept on reading the paper. "Some people are too impatient," she muttered. Once more the voice spoke. Now it sounded very angry, and it was so loud that the whole house shook.
"I want my bone back!"
The woman reached into the pot, grabbed the bone, and threw it out the window. In a voice just as loud, she shouted, "Take it!" There was an eerie silence. Then the woman heard footsteps scurrying away from the house down the road toward the cemetery, and she got up and served herself some soup. A man and a woman happened to sit next to one another on a train. The woman took out a book and began reading. The train stopped at a half-dozen stations, but she never looked up once. The man watched her for a while, then asked, "What are you reading?"
"It's a ghost story," she said. "It's very good, very spooky."
"Do you believe in ghosts?" he asked.
"Yes, I do," she replied. "There are ghosts everywhere."
"I don't believe in them," he said. "It's just a lot of superstition. In all my years, I've never seen a ghost. Not one."
"Haven't you?"
the woman said, and vanished. Leon and Todd loved baseball. When they were young, they had played on the town's baseball team. Leon had been the pitcher and Todd had played second base. Now that they were a lot older, they spent their free time watching baseball games on TV and talking about baseball. "Do you think they play baseball in heaven?" Leon asked Todd one day. "Oh, that's a good question," said Todd. "The one who gets there first should let the other one know somehow." As it turned out, Todd got to heaven first. and Leon waited patiently to hear from him. One day, Leon found Todd sitting in the living room, waiting for him. Leon was very excited to see him. "What is it like up there?" he asked. And what about baseball?" "Well, when it comes to baseball," said Todd, "I have some good news and I have some bad news. The good news is that we do play baseball in heaven. We have some fine teams. I play second base on my team, just like I used to in the old days. That's the good news." "What's the bad news?" asked Leon. "The bad news," said Todd, "is that you are scheduled to pitch tomorrow." A car broke down late at night, way out in the country. The driver remembered passing an empty house a few minutes earlier. "I'll stay there," he thought. "At least I'll get some sleep." He found some wood in the corner of the living room and made a fire in the fireplace. He covered himself with his coat and slept. Toward morning, the fire went out and the cold awakened him. "It'll be light soon," he thought. "Then I'll go for help." He closed his eyes again, but before he could doze off, there was a terrible crash. Something big and heavy had fallen out of the chimney. It lay on the floor for a minute, then it stood up and stared down at him. The man took one look and started running. He had never seen anything so horrible in his life. He paused just long enough to jump through a window. Then he ran and ran and ran and ran until he thought his lungs would burst. As he stood in the road panting, trying to catch his breath, he felt something tap him on the shoulder. He turned and found himself staring into two big bloody eyes and a grinning skull. It was the horrible thing.
"Pardon me," it said. "Is something wrong?"
A man named Joseph Blackwell came to Philadelphia on a business trip. He stayed with his friends in the big house they owned outside the city. That night, they had a good time visiting, but when Blackwell went to bed, he tossed and turned and couldn't sleep. Sometime during the night, he heard a car turn into the driveway. He went to the window to see who was arriving at such a late hour. In the moonlight, he saw a long black hearse filled with people. The driver of the hearse looked up at him. When Blackwell saw his queer, hideous face, he shuddered. The driver called to him.
"There is room for one more."
Then he waited for a minute or two and drove off. In the morning, Blackwell told his friends what had happened. "You were dreaming," they said. "I must have been," he said, "but it didn't seem like a dream." After breakfast, he went to Philadelphia. He spent the day high above the city in one of the new office buildings there. Late in the afternoon, he was waiting for an elevator to take him back down to the street. But when it arrived, it was very crowded. One of the passengers looked out and called to him.
"There's room for one more,"
he said. It was the driver of the hearse. "No thanks," said Blackwell. "I'll get the next one." The doors closed and the elevator started down. There was shrieking and screaming, and then the sound of a crash. The elevator had fallen to the bottom of the shaft. Everyone aboard was killed. The worms crawl in, the worms crawl out, the worms play pinochle on your snout. They eat your eyes, they eat your nose, they eat the jelly between your toes.